The scream came from the attic before anyone could stop it. Elira Hart pressed both hands against her mouth, but it was too late. The sound had already escaped, sharp and raw, echoing down through the floorboards of the old Hart family house. Downstairs, she heard footsteps. Fast ones, her mother's voice, tight with panic, calling her father's name. She backed away from the small round window at the top of the house, her chest rising and falling too quickly. Outside, in the fading light of evening, 5 wolves had crossed the northern field. Not ordinary wolves, pack wolves. Their fur caught the last orange light of the sun, and for one terrible moment, Elira had felt something stir inside her chest, something that always stirred when other wolves came near. A pull, a hum beneath her skin, and then, like always, nothing happened. No shift, no change, just her, human and still, standing at a window that was never supposed to be opened. The door to the attic burst open. Her father, Garrick Hart, filled the frame, his face pale with a fear that had become far too familiar over the last 19 years. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "How many times, Elira? How many times have I told you?" "I heard them," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see." "You cannot be seen." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled the curtain shut with a violence that made the old fabric tear slightly at the seam. "Do you understand what would happen if anyone saw you standing there? If anyone asked why the Hart family keeps a daughter locked away at the top of the house?" Elira said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had heard this speech more times than she could count, in more forms than she could remember, since she was old enough to understand what she was, or rather, what she was not. She was not a wolf. Not really, not in the way that mattered to a pack like theirs. Every child born into the Blackwood pack carried the wolf inside them from birth, waiting patiently for the day it would rise to the surface and claim its rightful place beside the human half of their soul. For most, that day came sometime between their 13th and 16th year, in a moment of pain and transformation that every young wolf both feared and longed for. Elira had waited for that day too. She had counted down the months, imagined the moment, prepared herself for the change that would finally make her whole. It never came. 19 years old now, and her wolf remained silent, buried somewhere so deep inside her that even the strongest healers in the territory could not find it, let alone wake it. The elders had a word for wolves like her, a cruel word, spoken only in whispers, passed from mouth to mouth like poison. Broken. "Your mother is beside herself," Garrick said, softer now, though the fear had not left his eyes. "The scouts saw movement near the house, if word reaches the wrong ears." "What movement?" Elira asked. "I only opened the window a crack." "A crack is enough." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment, he looked older than his 50 years, worn down by 2 decades of guarding a secret that grew heavier with every passing season. "You know what is happening this month. You know who is traveling through our lands." Of course she knew. The entire pack had spoken of nothing else for weeks. The Alpha King himself, Cale Thorne, ruler of every pack bound beneath the Great Alliance, was making his journey through the smaller territories before the choosing, the ceremony held once every 5 years, in which he selected a mate from among the noble bloodlines of the packs. It was said he had never chosen anyone in the 2 ceremonies that came before, that no scent had ever called to him strongly enough. This year, the pressure was greater than ever. The council wanted an heir. The kingdom wanted stability. And the Blackwood pack, like every other pack in his path, wanted desperately to make a good impression, to offer up their finest and brightest, to prove their worth to the most powerful wolf alive. A pack with a broken daughter hidden in the attic did not fit that picture. "I only wanted air," Elira said again, quieter this time. Her father's shoulders sagged. He was not a cruel man, not truly, though the years of fear had carved deep grooves of frustration into the way he spoke to her. He loved her. She believed that, mostly, on the good days. But love and shame had tangled together inside him so completely that she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. "Stay away from the window until the king's procession has passed through our lands," he said. "Please, Elira, for your own sake as much as ours." He left without waiting for her answer, closing the door behind him. She heard the small click of the lock turning from the outside, a sound so familiar now that it barely registered anymore. Just another lock, another door, another small cage inside the larger cage of her life. Alira sat down on the narrow bed pushed against the far wall and looked around the room that had been hers for as long as she could remember. A single dresser, a shelf of books she had read so many times the spines had softened and cracked. A small mirror, cracked in one corner, that showed her a face she barely recognized as her own some days. Dark hair that fell past her shoulders, eyes the color of amber, or so her mother used to say, back when her mother still said kind things to her. A face that might have been pretty if it did not carry so much quiet sadness behind it. She had not always lived in the attic. There had been a time, when she was very small, before her failure to shift became undeniable, when she had a room on the second floor like any other child in the house. She remembered running through the halls with her younger sister, Talia, remembered laughter that did not feel forced, remembered a version of her family that had not yet learned to be afraid of her. That version of her family no longer existed. She moved to the small window again, careful this time to stay behind the curtain, and peered through the narrow gap at the edge of the fabric. The wolves were gone now, vanished back into the tree line at the border of the Hart family land. But the hum beneath her skin remained, faint and strange, like a string that had been plucked somewhere far away and was still quietly vibrating. It always felt like that when other wolves came close. A pull she could not explain. A recognition that made no sense for someone whose own wolf had never woken. The healers said it was simply the way her body responded to pack magic, nothing more. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, Alira wondered if there was something else happening inside her, something none of them had ever managed to name. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and let her eyes fall closed. Somewhere out there, beyond the fields and the tree line and the borders of everything she had ever known, an entire world was moving forward without her. Packs were gathering, alliances were forming. A king was traveling through the land, searching for a mate who might finally answer whatever call his wolf had been listening for. And here she sat, locked in an attic, waiting for a life that never seemed to arrive. She did not know, in that quiet moment with her eyes closed and her forehead against the glass, that the wind carried sense farther than any of them understood. She did not know that even through a cracked window and a drawn curtain, something of her had already slipped free into the evening air. A trace, a whisper, enough. 3 days passed in the same slow rhythm that had shaped every day of her life for years. Meals brought up on a tray by her mother, Wren, who rarely met her eyes anymore, as though looking too directly at her daughter might confirm something she did not want to accept. Brief visits from Talia, 17 now, and full of the same nervous energy that ran through the whole family whenever the topic of the king's procession came up. Long stretches of silence, broken only by the sound of wind against the old house and the distant calls of wolves running free across land Alira had not walked in years. On the fourth evening, everything changed. It began with noise. Voices below, more than usual, carrying an urgency that made Alira sit up straight on her bed. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against the wood, straining to catch words through the thick old timber. "Cannot be here," her father was saying, his voice pitched high with panic. "There must be some mistake." Another voice answered, deep and calm, and entirely unfamiliar, a voice that carried an authority so absolute that Alira felt it settle over the whole house like a change in air pressure before a storm. "There is no mistake," the voice said. "I know what I scented 3 nights ago, Garrick Hart, and I intend to find its source before I leave your land." Alira's blood went cold. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. It could not be. It was not possible. And yet some deep instinctive part of her already understood, with a certainty that defied all logic, exactly who stood in the rooms below her. The Alpha King had come to the Hart house, and he had come because of her. She heard more voices now, her mother's pleading tone layered beneath her father's stammering excuses, and beneath all of it, that deep unfamiliar voice, steady and unmoved, cutting through their panic like a blade through soft cloth. "I do not care for excuses," the voice said. "I care for truth. Something in this house called to my wolf 3 nights past, stronger than anything either of us has felt in years. I will not leave until I understand what it was." Alira pressed her back against the far wall of the attic, her breath coming in short, shallow pulls. Downstairs, her family's world was beginning to crack open, and she knew, with a dread that settled deep in her stomach, that it was only a matter of time before that crack reached all the way up to her. Footsteps began climbing the stairs. Her father's voice rose in protest, but it did no good. The footsteps continued, unhurried, deliberate, each one landing with a weight that seemed to shake the old wood of the staircase. Illyra stood frozen in the center of the small attic room, watching the door, her hands curled into fists at her sides, though she had nowhere to run and no way to hide. The lock turned from the outside. The door swung open. And there, filling the frame the way her father had filled it days before, but with a presence so much larger, so much more commanding, stood a man Illyra recognized instantly, though she had never once laid eyes on him before this moment. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair swept back from a face carved with sharp, powerful lines, eyes the color of storm clouds, gray shot through with something almost silver, fixed on her with an intensity that made the air leave her lungs entirely. Cale Thorne, the Alpha King. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Illyra felt the hum beneath her skin rise into something far stronger than she had ever known, a pull so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. Across the small room, she watched the king's jaw tighten, watched something shift behind those storm-gray eyes, something raw and startled and entirely unguarded. "There you are," he said quietly, and his voice, when it was not raised in command, carried a different kind of weight entirely. Something closer to wonder. Behind him, in the doorway, her father's face had gone the color of ash. "Your Majesty," Garrick began, his voice shaking. "Please, let me explain." Cale did not turn around. His eyes remained fixed on Illyra, as though nothing else in the world existed beyond the small attic room and the woman standing in the middle of it. "Explain," he said, "why you have kept your daughter locked away like something to be ashamed of. Because I promise you, Garrick Hart, whatever reason you give me had better be a very good one." Illyra's heart pounded so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. She had spent 19 years believing herself broken, unworthy, a shameful secret to be hidden away from the world. She had never once imagined that the most powerful wolf in the entire kingdom would stand in her doorway and look at her the way Cale Thorne was looking at her now, like she was something precious, like she was something found. The wind outside picked up, rattling the small window she had been forbidden to open, and somewhere deep inside her, buried under 19 years of silence, something stirred that had never stirred before. Not a shift, not yet, but something. A whisper of a wolf that might, after everything, still be waiting to wake. Cale Thorne took one slow step into the room, his eyes never leaving hers, and behind him, the world Illyra had always known began, quietly and irreversibly, to fall apart. The silence in the attic stretched so long that Illyra could hear her own pulse in her ears. Cale Thorne had not moved from the doorway, and yet the room felt smaller with him in it, as though his presence alone had rearranged the space around them. "Your Majesty," Garrick tried again, stepping forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture that did nothing to hide the tremble in his fingers. "My daughter is unwell. She has always been unwell. It is why we keep her apart from the rest of the pack, for her own protection." "Unwell." Cale repeated the word slowly, testing its weight, and found it lacking. He turned, finally, to face her father directly, and the shift in his expression was immediate. Where his eyes had softened looking at Illyra, they hardened now into something cold and unyielding. "Your daughter's scent called to my wolf from 3 miles away, through closed windows and drawn curtains, stronger than any scent I have encountered in over a decade of searching. That is not the mark of someone unwell. That is the mark of something rare." Wren Hart appeared in the doorway then, breathless from climbing the stairs too quickly, her eyes darting between her husband, the king, and the daughter she had spent years trying not to look at directly. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "you must understand, we only ever wanted to protect her." "Protect her from what?" Cale asked. "From being seen? From being known?" Neither parent answered. The silence that followed told him everything their words had not. Illyra watched the exchange as though from a great distance, still too stunned to fully process what was happening. 19 years of hiding, of shame, of locked doors, and now the most powerful wolf in the kingdom stood in her attic, demanding answers her own parents could not give. Part of her wanted to shrink back, to disappear the way she always had when attention turned toward her. But another part of her, a part she barely recognized, wanted to step forward instead. "I can speak for myself," she said quietly. Every eye in the room turned to her. It was the first time she had spoken since Cale entered, and her voice, though soft, carried more steadiness than she felt. Cale's expression shifted again, something almost like approval flickering across his sharp features. "Then speak," he said. "Tell me what your parents will not." Alira glanced at her father, whose face had gone rigid with a fear she had seen countless times before, though never quite this intense. She glanced at her mother, whose eyes were glassy with unshed tears. And then she looked back at the king, and found, for reasons she could not fully explain, that his presence made it easier to speak the truth, rather than harder. "My wolf never woke," she said. "I passed the age when it should have happened years ago. The healers could not explain it. The elders called me broken, so my family decided it was safer, for everyone, if the rest of the pack never learned that a heart daughter carried no wolf at all." The words hung in the air, plain and unadorned, stripped of the shame that usually colored them when she thought of them privately. Saying them aloud to this man, in this moment, felt strangely like setting down something she had carried for far too long. Cale studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes moving over her face, as though searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "No wolf woke," he repeated slowly. "And yet your scent is the strongest I have ever encountered. Do you understand how impossible that should be?" "I only know what I have been told my whole life," Alira said, "that I am broken, that there is something wrong with me that no one has ever been able to fix." "They are wrong," Cale said, and the certainty in his voice was so absolute that it startled her. "Whatever this is, Alira Hart, it is not broken. I have traveled through a dozen territories searching for a mate whose scent might finally answer what my wolf has been asking for since the day I took the throne. Not once, in 10 years, has anything come close to what I felt 3 nights ago standing 3 miles from this house." Garrick made a small strangled sound. "Mate," he said, as though the word itself might undo him. "Yes," Cale said, not looking away from Alira. "Mate." The word landed in the room, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everyone present. Alira felt her breath catch entirely, her mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just said. She had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of even the simplest kindness from her own family, that the idea of being claimed as the mate of the Alpha King felt like something from a story, rather than something happening in the cramped attic room she had lived in for most of her life. "You cannot be certain," Wren said, her voice thin with disbelief, and something that sounded almost like fear. "You have only just met her." "I do not need more time to be certain," Cale said. "The bond does not wait for convenience, Mrs. Hart. It recognizes what it recognizes, the moment it recognizes it. And it has recognized your daughter." Alira's legs felt unsteady beneath her. She reached out and gripped the edge of the dresser to keep herself upright, her mind spinning through 19 years of memories. Every locked door, every whispered insult, every moment she had been told she did not belong among her own people, all of it colliding now with the impossible reality standing in front of her. "Why," she asked quietly, "would something so powerful choose someone broken?" Cale crossed the room in a few unhurried steps, until he stood directly before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze. Up close, the intensity of his presence was almost overwhelming, a warmth radiating from him that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the sheer force of who he was. "You are not broken," he said, his voice low, meant only for her, though the room was small enough that everyone could still hear. "I do not know yet what kept your wolf from waking, or what it means that your scent burns brighter than any I have known. But I know what my instincts tell me, and they have never once been wrong. Whatever you are, Alira Hart, you are not a mistake." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, threatening to spill despite her best efforts to hold them back. 19 years of being told the opposite of what this man now stood before her insisting was true, and she did not know how to hold both truths in her chest at once, without something inside her breaking open. Behind them, her father found his voice again, though it came out smaller than before. "Your Majesty, if this is truly a bond, then surely you understand the difficulty of the situation. She has never left this house." She knows nothing of pack life, of court, of the responsibilities that would come with standing beside you. Then she will learn, Cale said simply, as though the matter required no further discussion. As will you learn, Garrick Hart, the cost of hiding what should have been celebrated. The threat beneath his calm words was unmistakable, and Alira watched her father pale further, his earlier bluster collapsing entirely under the weight of a king's quiet disapproval. Cale turned back to Alira, and something in his expression softened once more, the hardness reserved for her parents falling away entirely when directed at her. I will not force you into anything you do not choose for yourself, he said. The bond calls to my wolf, but I understand that you have spent your life believing things about yourself that were never true. I ask only that you allow me the chance to show you otherwise. Alira looked past him, toward her parents standing frozen in the doorway, toward the small window she had been forbidden to open, toward the narrow bed and cracked mirror and every small confinement that had shaped her entire existence. And then she looked back at the king, at those storm-gray eyes that had looked at her, for the first time in her memory, without a single trace of shame. I do not know how to be anything other than what I have always been, she said softly. Hidden, quiet, out of the way. Then we will discover together what you might become instead, Cale said. If you will allow it. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the old window in its frame, and somewhere far below, Alira could hear the low murmur of voices belonging to the king's guard, waiting patiently in the yard, for whatever their ruler decided in the attic above them. She thought of 19 years spent believing she did not deserve to be seen, and she thought of the way this stranger had looked at her, as though seeing her clearly for the very first time, changed nothing about her worth, and everything about how the world might finally treat her. Yes, she said, before she could talk herself out of it, I will allow it. Something shifted in Cale's expression, relief and satisfaction mingling with a warmth that reached all the way to his eyes. Behind him, her parents exchanged a look Alira could not fully read, fear and disbelief, and something that might, if she allowed herself to hope, have been the first stirrings of shame at how they had treated their own daughter. The Alpha King extended his hand toward her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Alira Hart stepped forward without waiting to be told it was allowed. The walk down the attic stairs felt longer than any journey Alira had ever taken, though it lasted only a few short minutes. Each step brought her closer to a world she had been shielded from her entire life, and with every creak of the old wooden boards beneath her feet, she felt the weight of 19 years of confinement pressing against her chest. Cale did not release her hand once they reached the ground floor. If anything, his grip tightened slightly, as though he sensed her nerves and meant to anchor her against them. The main room of the Hart house had filled with people while they were upstairs, members of the king's personal guard standing at attention near the door, their expressions carefully neutral despite the obvious tension crackling through the air. Word will spread quickly, Cale said quietly, leaning slightly toward her as they walked. By morning, every pack within 100 miles will know that I have found my mate. I want you prepared for what that means. Alira swallowed hard. What does it mean? Attention, he said. Curiosity. Some will be kind. Others will not be, at least not at first. There are those who have waited a long time for me to choose, and not all of them will be pleased to learn my choice has already been made. She thought of the whispers she had grown up hearing about herself, the cruel word that had followed her through every year of her life, and wondered whether the attention of an entire kingdom might prove even harder to bear than the isolation had been. Behind them, Garrick and Wren Hart hovered near the doorway, uncertain of their place in a situation that had shifted so completely beyond their control. Talia stood a little apart from her parents, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like relief, as though some part of her had been waiting for this moment, without ever daring to hope it might come. Alira, Talia said softly, stepping forward before their parents could stop her. I am glad, truly. It was such a small thing, 4 simple words, and yet they struck Alira harder than she expected. In 19 years, her sister had rarely spoken to her at all, kept at a careful distance by parents who feared what association with a broken sibling might cost her. To hear even this small kindness now, in front of the king and his entire guard, felt like a crack of light through a door that had been sealed for far too long. Thank you, Alira managed, her voice thick. Cale watched the exchange without comment, though Alira caught the slight narrowing of his eyes as he studied Talia, weighing something she could not guess at. Whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it to himself for the moment, turning instead to address her parents directly. "I will send word once she is settled at the royal territory," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You will not attempt to contact her, nor to influence what she chooses to share about her years in this house. Do I make myself clear?" Garrick nodded quickly, and Ren pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, unable to speak at all. Alira felt a strange pang of something she could not name, watching her parents reduced to such nervous compliance after years of holding absolute authority over her entire existence. She had spent so long fearing them, and now, in the span of a single evening, that fear had transferred entirely onto someone else. They left the house without further ceremony, stepping out into the cool evening air. Alira had not stood outside beneath an open sky in longer than she could remember, and the sensation of it, wind against her face, grass beneath her feet, the enormous stretch of stars overhead, nearly overwhelmed her all at once. She stumbled slightly, and Cale's hand steadied her immediately, his grip firm and sure. "It has been a long time," she admitted quietly, embarrassed by how affected she was by something as simple as open air. "Then we will go slowly," Cale said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet understanding that surprised her. The king's guard fell into formation around them as they made their way toward a group of horses waiting near the edge of the property. Sleek, dark animals that shifted restlessly at the scent of so many wolves nearby. Alira had never ridden a horse in her life, another small deprivation among so many others, and Cale seemed to sense her hesitation without needing to be told. "You will ride with me," he said, and it was not a question. He lifted her onto the horse before she could protest, settling behind her with an ease that spoke of years of practice, and the horse began to move beneath them with a smoothness that made her breath catch all over again. Behind them, the Hart house grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely behind the tree line, taking with it 19 years of locked doors and whispered shame. They traveled through the night, the king's guard riding in careful formation around them, and Alira found herself dozing against Cale's chest, despite her best efforts to stay alert and absorb every moment of a world so suddenly opened to her. When she woke, gray light was beginning to touch the horizon, and the landscape around them had changed entirely, rolling hills giving way to denser forest, the air carrying scents she did not recognize. "We are close," Cale said quietly, noticing she had woken. "The royal territory lies just beyond this ridge." Alira straightened, suddenly nervous all over again. "What should I expect?" "Curiosity," he said again, echoing his earlier warning. "My court has waited a long time to see who might finally catch my attention. Some will test you, in small ways and large. Do not let it shake you. You have already survived worse than court gossip." She appreciated the honesty, even as it did little to calm the nervous twist in her stomach. As they crested the ridge, the royal territory came into view below them, and Alira felt her breath leave her entirely at the sight of it. A city unlike anything she had imagined, stone buildings rising in elegant spirals, a great fortress at its center that could only be the royal keep, and beyond it all, forest stretching in every direction as far as she could see, alive with the movement of countless wolves running free beneath the dawn sky. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It will be your home now," Cale said, and something in his voice carried a quiet hope that she found herself wanting to live up to, despite every uncertainty still churning inside her. They descended toward the city as the sun fully rose, and word of their arrival seemed to spread ahead of them like a current through water. By the time they reached the outer gates, a crowd had already begun to gather, wolves and humans alike, drawn by whispers of the king's return, and more than that, by whispers of who rode beside him. Alira felt every eye upon her as they passed through the gates, felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions pressing against her from every direction. She sat up straighter, drawing on some reserve of courage she had not known she possessed, and reminded herself of the words Cale had spoken in the attic only hours before. Not broken, not a mistake. Near the central square, a small group of finely dressed figures had gathered near the steps of the royal keep, clearly members of the court who had been alerted to the king's approach. Among them stood a woman with striking pale hair and sharp, assessing eyes, dressed in fabrics far finer than anything Alira had ever worn. watching their arrival with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "Who is that?" Elira asked quietly. Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lyra Voss," he said, "daughter of one of the oldest noble bloodlines in the kingdom. She has long been favored by the council as a likely choice for my mate, though I have never given her cause to believe the feeling was returned." Elira studied the woman a moment longer, taking in the cool composure of her expression, the way her eyes moved over Elira with a calculation that felt anything but friendly. Something told her that whatever challenges lay ahead in this new life, Lyra Voss would not be the last of them, nor likely the easiest to face. They reached the base of the keep steps, and Cale dismounted first, reaching up to help Elira down beside him. The crowd had grown considerably in the short time since their arrival, and the weight of so many curious eyes settled over her like a physical thing. She felt herself instinctively wanting to shrink back, to disappear, the way she had learned to disappear for most of her life. Cale's hand found hers again, steady and sure, and he leaned close enough to speak only for her ears. "You do not have to hide anymore," he said quietly. "Not here, not ever again." Elira drew a slow breath, and for the first time in 19 years, she lifted her chin instead of lowering it, and let herself be seen. The great hall of the royal keep was unlike anything Elira had ever imagined, let alone stood inside. High stone walls rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow, hung with banners bearing the crest of the United Pax, a wolf howling beneath a crown of silver stars. Long windows let in the morning light, illuminating a room that could have swallowed the entire Hart House 3 times over. She stood near the center of it, feeling smaller than she had felt even in the attic, while members of the King's Council filed in one by one to be introduced. Names blurred together in her mind almost as quickly as she heard them, a parade of unfamiliar faces studying her with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to outright suspicion. One face, however, remained steady and kind throughout the introductions. An older man with silver hair and gentle eyes, introduced as Edmund Vale, the king's chief advisor, and one of the few members of the court who had served under Cale's father before him. "You must forgive the others," Edmund said quietly, once the last of the council had departed to spread word of the morning's events. "Change unsettles people, especially change as sudden as this. Give them time, and most will come around." "Most," Elira repeated, catching the careful qualification in his words. Edmund's expression grew a touch more serious. "There are always some who resist change no matter how much time is given. I would advise caution, particularly where Lyra Voss and her allies are concerned. Her family has held influence in this court for 3 generations. They will not relinquish the hope of a stronger connection to the throne without some resistance." Elira thought of the woman she had seen on the steps, the cool assessment in her pale eyes, and felt a small chill settle over her despite the warmth of the hall around them. Cale returned then, having stepped away briefly, to address a matter with the guard, and the shift in Edmund's demeanor was immediate, respectful, and attentive, in a way that spoke of long years of loyal service. "Your Majesty," he said with a slight bow, "I was just explaining to Lady Elira the delicate nature of court politics." "Lady Elira," Cale repeated, something almost amused flickering across his features. "I suppose that is what she is now." "What else would I be called?" Elira asked, genuinely uncertain. "Whatever you wish," Cale said, "though the court will insist on formalities regardless of your preference. It is simply how these things are done." The idea of being called Lady Anything, after a lifetime of being called broken behind closed doors, sat strangely in her chest. She said nothing further on the matter, though Cale seemed to sense her discomfort, and did not push the subject. Over the following days, Elira found herself swept into a world entirely foreign to everything she had known. She was given chambers within the keep itself, rooms larger and finer than anything she could have imagined, with windows that opened freely onto gardens below, rather than being sealed shut against the world. A woman named Nora was assigned to assist her, warm and quick to laugh, and slowly, cautiously, Elira allowed herself to relax in her company, in a way she had not relaxed around another person in years. But the ease of her private moments did not extend to the wider court. Wherever she went within the keep, she felt eyes following her, heard whispers that quieted whenever she drew near, caught fragments of conversation that made it clear not everyone shared Edmund's patience for change. The word broken, which she had hoped to leave behind entirely at the Hart House, seemed to have traveled with her regardless, whispered now not by her own family, but by strangers who knew nothing of her beyond rumor. "They are only afraid," Cale told her one evening, finding her seated alone in the garden, after a particularly difficult day of introductions, and thinly veiled insults from members of the court, who considered her presence an inconvenience to their own ambitions. "Fear makes people cruel, more often than cruelty makes people cruel. That does not make it easier to bear," Elira admitted. "No," Cale agreed, settling onto the stone bench beside her. "But you have borne worse for far longer, and without anyone standing beside you while you did it. That, at least, has changed." She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the sincerity in his storm-gray eyes, the quiet steadiness that seemed to radiate from him even in moments of stillness. In the days since leaving the attic, she had watched him navigate the demands of ruling an entire kingdom with a patience and fairness that surprised her, given everything she had once assumed about the nature of power. He listened more than he spoke. He considered arguments before dismissing them. And whenever the topic of her own background arose among the council, he defended her without hesitation, cutting off cruel speculation with a firmness that left no room for argument. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. "What happens to someone you only met a few days ago?" Cale considered the question carefully before answering, as though it deserved more than a quick response. "The bond matters," he said. "That is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is more than that now. I have watched you these past days, Elira. I have watched you walk into rooms full of people who whisper about you, and hold your chin high regardless. I have watched you learn things you were never taught, adapt to a life you never asked for, and do it all without a single complaint. That is not the behavior of someone broken. That is the behavior of someone remarkably strong." Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to praise of any kind, let alone praise so direct and unguarded. "I do not feel strong," she admitted. "Most days I feel as though I am pretending, waiting for someone to notice I do not belong here." "You belong here," Cale said, and the certainty in his voice was the same certainty she had heard in the attic on the very first night. "More than you know." A silence settled between them, comfortable rather than strained, and Elira found herself studying the garden around them, the careful arrangement of flowers and stone paths, the distant sound of wolves calling to one another somewhere beyond the keep walls. It was a beautiful place, and slowly, cautiously, she was beginning to let herself believe it might one day feel like home. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a young guard, breathless from having run some distance, who bowed quickly before addressing the king. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion. There is a matter requiring your attention in the West Wing. Lady Voss has requested an audience regarding the upcoming council session." Cale's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something guarded passing over his features before he rose from the bench. "I will attend to it," he said, then turned back to Elira. "Will you be well here alone for a time?" "Of course," she said, though something in the mention of Lyra Voss's name left a faint unease settling in her chest. He left with the guard, and Elira remained in the garden a while longer, watching the last light of evening fade across the sky. She thought of the pale, calculating eyes she had seen on the steps of the keep, of Edmund's careful warning, and wondered how long the peace of these last few days might last before the challenges Cale had promised finally arrived in earnest. She did not have to wonder long. The following morning, as she made her way toward the dining hall for the first formal meal she would share with the full council, she found Lyra Voss waiting for her in the corridor, alone, her expression composed into something that might have passed for friendliness, if not for the coldness lurking just beneath it. "Lady Elira," Lyra said smoothly, "I thought we might speak, before the others arrive." Elira paused, uncertain of the wisdom of the conversation, but unwilling to appear intimidated. "Of course." Lyra's smile did not reach her eyes. "I only wish to offer you some friendly advice. Court can be a difficult place for those unaccustomed to it, especially for those with such an unusual history." The implication was clear enough, though delivered with enough polish to avoid outright insult. Elira held her ground, refusing to let the words unsettle her the way they were surely intended to. "I am learning quickly," she said evenly. "Thank you for your concern." Something flickered across Lyra's expression, a brief flash of surprise at the steadiness of the response, quickly smoothed back into composed indifference. "I am sure you are," she said, and there was something in her tone that made the words sound far less like reassurance than they were meant to. "Let us hope, for all our sakes, that your learning is fast enough." She turned and walked away without another word, leaving Alira standing alone in the corridor, with the distinct sense that whatever peace she had found in these first days at the royal keep was about to be tested in ways she could not yet predict. The council chamber fell silent the moment Alira entered, every head turning to watch her cross the polished stone floor, toward the seat reserved beside the king's own chair at the head of the long table. She had grown somewhat accustomed to being watched over the past week, but the formal setting of the council session brought a new weight to the attention. Dozens of powerful figures from across the United Pax gathered in one room, each of them measuring her with careful, assessing eyes. Kale rose slightly as she approached, a small gesture of respect that she noticed did not go unnoticed by the rest of the room. She took her seat, aware of the murmurs rippling around the table, and forced herself to keep her spine straight and her expression calm. "Today's session concerns preparations for the formal announcement," Edmund said, opening the proceedings with his usual measured tone. "The kingdom must be informed properly of the bond between His Majesty and Lady Alira, and a ceremony arranged to mark the occasion." A murmur of discussion followed, most of it practical in nature, questions of timing and logistics, and which noble houses ought to be invited to witness the announcement. But beneath the surface of practical concerns, Alira could sense a current of unspoken tension running through the room, and it did not take long for that tension to surface directly. "Forgive my bluntness," said an older council member seated near the far end of the table, a man Alira had been introduced to as Lord Ashwin, "but should we not first address the matter of Lady Alira's history, before committing to a public announcement? Rumors have already begun circulating regarding her background. It would serve the crown poorly to celebrate a union built on unresolved questions." Alira felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression steady, refusing to let the challenge unsettle her outwardly, even as her pulse quickened beneath the surface. "What questions would those be, Lord Ashwin?" Kale asked, his voice carrying an edge of warning that most of the room seemed to recognize and heed, though Ashwin pressed on regardless. "It is said the girl never shifted," Ashwin continued, choosing his next words with obvious care, "that her own family hid her away for years rather than present her to the pack. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but a king's mate ought to embody the strength of the wolf, not its absence." The words landed like a slap, and Alira felt heat rise in her face, old shame threatening to surface after days of carefully holding it at bay. Around the table, several council members shifted uncomfortably, though whether from disagreement or simple discomfort at the bluntness of the accusation, she could not tell. Before Kale could respond, Alira found herself speaking, her voice steadier than she expected, given the trembling she felt inside. "You are correct that my wolf never woke," she said, meeting Ashwin's gaze directly, rather than shrinking from it. "I do not know why, and neither do the healers who examined me over the years. But I would ask you this, Lord Ashwin. Since arriving here, has my scent not struck every wolf in this room as unusually strong? Has the bond the king speaks of not proven itself entirely real, regardless of whatever absence exists within me?" Ashwin's expression flickered with something like surprise at being addressed so directly, but he did not immediately concede the point. "Strength of scent is not the same as strength of wolf," he said. "The kingdom deserves a queen who can stand fully among her people, not one who carries an absence at her core." "Enough," Kale said, his voice cutting through the chamber, with a finality that ended the discussion immediately. "I will not have my mate spoken of as though she is a flaw, to be debated by committee. Whatever absence exists within her, it has not diminished the bond, nor will it diminish her place at my side. This matter is not open for further discussion." Ashwin inclined his head in reluctant deference, though Alira did not miss the way his eyes lingered on her with continued skepticism, as the council moved on to other matters. Across the table, Lyra Voss remained silent throughout the exchange, though Alira caught the faint, satisfied curve of her lips at Ashwin's challenge, a small tell that confirmed what Edmund had warned her of days before. The session continued for another hour, practical matters of the announcement ceremony worked through with careful attention to protocol, but Alira found it difficult to focus fully on the discussion, her mind still turning over the confrontation with Ashwin. It was one thing to hear whispers in the corridors, another entirely, to have her worth debated openly, before the most powerful figures in the kingdom, as though her value could be measured and found wanting by committee vote. When the session finally ended, she rose from her seat with relief, eager to escape the weight of so many watching eyes. Cale fell into step beside her as they left the chamber, his expression still carrying traces of the anger he had suppressed during the meeting. "I am sorry you had to endure that," he said once they were alone in the corridor. "You do not need to apologize for the honesty of others," Alira said, though her voice carried less conviction than she intended. "Honesty and cruelty are not the same thing," Cale said. "Ashwin could have raised his concerns privately, in a manner that did not require humiliating you before the full council. He chose otherwise, and that choice reflects poorly on him, not on you." Alira appreciated the sentiment, even as the sting of the confrontation lingered. She thought of her father's voice from years past, of every whispered insult she had absorbed throughout her childhood, and wondered whether she would ever reach a point where such words no longer found purchase somewhere deep inside her. That evening, unable to sleep, she made her way alone to the gardens, seeking the quiet solitude that had become a small comfort in the whirlwind of her new life. The moon hung full and bright overhead, casting silver light across the stone paths, and she found herself wandering deeper into the grounds than she usually ventured, drawn by some restless energy she could not name. She did not notice, at first, the low growl that rippled through the darkness ahead of her. By the time she registered the sound, a shape had already emerged from the shadows between the trees, a wolf, larger than any she had encountered before, its fur dark, and its eyes carrying a wildness that made her breath catch in sudden alarm. She recognized, with a jolt of fear, that this was no ordinary wolf, out for an evening run. Something about its posture, the deliberate way it stalked toward her rather than fleeing at her approach, told her this encounter was not accidental. Her mind raced through everything she had learned in her short time at the keep, every instinct she had never been given the chance to properly develop, given how her life had unfolded thus far. She had no wolf to call upon, no shift to protect her, only the fragile human body that had never been enough to satisfy anyone's expectations of what a pack member ought to be. And yet, as the wolf advanced and her fear spiked into something sharper and more urgent, Alira felt something stir deep within her chest. The same hum she had always felt around other wolves, but stronger now, so much stronger, rising like a tide she could not hope to contain. The wolf lunged, and something inside Alira answered. A burst of light erupted from Alira's chest, silver and searing, throwing the attacking wolf backward, with a force that sent it tumbling across the garden path with a startled yelp. She stumbled back, her own body trembling from the sheer intensity of whatever had just moved through her, staring down at her hands as though they belonged to someone else entirely. The wolf recovered quickly, shaking off the impact and rising again with a snarl. But before it could close the distance a second time, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the garden, and Cale appeared from the darkness, already mid-shift, his own wolf form massive and commanding, as he placed himself directly between Alira and the threat. The fight that followed lasted only moments. Cale's wolf was larger, faster, and driven by a fury Alira had never seen from him in his human form, and the attacking wolf broke and fled into the trees within seconds of the confrontation beginning, disappearing into the darkness before the king's guard could arrive to give chase. Cale shifted back almost immediately, crossing the remaining distance to Alira in a few urgent strides, his hands finding her shoulders as he searched her face and body for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with barely restrained alarm. "I do not think so," Alira said, still staring at her own trembling hands. "Something happened. There was light, and the wolf was thrown back, and I do not know how or why." Cale's expression shifted, alarm giving way to something like careful wonder, as he studied her more closely. "Your eyes," he said quietly. "They were silver. Just for a moment, before I arrived." Guards began pouring into the garden, alerted by the commotion, and the scene quickly dissolved into a flurry of urgent questions and careful searches of the surrounding grounds, though the attacking wolf had vanished entirely without a trace. Edmund arrived not long after, his expression grave as he took in the details of what had occurred. "This was no random encounter," he said, once the guards had dispersed to continue their search. "Someone sent that wolf, Your Majesty. Lady Alira was targeted deliberately." Cale's jaw tightened, his eyes dark with a controlled fury that Alira had not seen from him before. "Find out who," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I want answers by morning." Alira, still shaken from the encounter, found herself more preoccupied with the strange power that had surged through her than with the question of who might have sent the attack. She had spent 19 years believing herself entirely without a wolf, without any trace of the strength that defined every other member of her pack, and yet something had risen within her in that moment of danger, something powerful enough to throw back a fully grown wolf with a single burst of light. "What was that?" she asked quietly, once the immediate chaos had settled, and Cale had insisted on walking her back toward her chambers personally, unwilling to let her out of his sight, even for a moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have never seen anything quite like it. But whatever it was, Alira, it was not nothing. It was not the absence your family and this court have accused you of carrying. It was something entirely its own." She turned the thought over carefully as they walked, trying to reconcile 19 years of being told she lacked something essential with the reality of power she had just felt surge through her own body. Perhaps, she thought, she had never been missing anything at all. Perhaps whatever lived inside her had simply been waiting, all this time, for a reason strong enough to finally answer its call. The following days passed in a haze of investigation and heightened security, the King's Guard doubling their presence around Alira's chambers and accompanying her wherever she moved throughout the keep. No definitive proof emerged regarding who had sent the wolf, though suspicions settled heavily, if quietly, on Lyra Voss and her allies, given the timing of the attack so soon after the tense council session. Despite the shadow the incident cast over the following week, preparations for the formal announcement continued, and the day of the ceremony arrived with an energy that seemed to grip the entire royal territory. Alira woke that morning with a knot of nervous anticipation tightening in her chest, aware that within hours she would stand before the assembled nobility of every pack in the kingdom and be formally declared the mate of the Alpha King. Nora helped her dress in the hours before the ceremony, fastening her into a gown of deep silver that seemed to catch and hold the light in a way that reminded Alira uncomfortably of the strange glow she had summoned in the garden. She studied her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her, transformed so completely from the girl who had spent years hidden away in a locked attic room. "You look every bit a queen," Nora said softly, adjusting a final fold of fabric. "I do not feel like one," Alira admitted. "Feelings take time to catch up with truth," Nora said, with a wisdom that surprised Alira coming from someone so young. "Give it time. It will come." The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Banners hung in every direction, the assembled crowd stretching further than Alira could have imagined possible. Representatives from every pack in the kingdom gathered to witness the announcement. She stood at the edge of the hall, waiting for her moment to enter, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone nearby must be able to hear it. Edmund appeared at her side, offering a reassuring smile. "The king asked me to remind you," he said, "that you are not walking into that hall alone, whatever it may feel like. He will be waiting at the other end of it." The words steadied her more than she expected, and when the great doors finally opened and the assembled crowd turned to watch her entrance, Alira lifted her chin, drew a slow breath, and began the long walk toward the throne where Cale Thorne stood waiting, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with a warmth that made the enormity of the crowd feel, for one suspended moment, entirely irrelevant. The walk across the great hall felt endless, though Alira knew only moments had passed by the time she reached the base of the throne where Cale stood waiting. Thousands of eyes tracked her every step, representatives from packs she had never even heard the names of, nobility dressed in finery that made her own silver gown feel almost plain by comparison. And yet, when she finally reached the king, and he extended his hand to help her up the final step, all the noise and weight of so many watching eyes seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the steadiness of his gaze and the warmth of his grip around her fingers. "You have done well," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear it. Turning to face the assembled crowd, Cale raised his voice to carry across the entire hall, and the enormous chamber fell into an immediate, expectant silence. "People of the United Packs," he began, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man born to command, "I stand before you today to declare what my wolf recognized the moment it caught her scent. Alira Hart is my mate, chosen not by council decision or noble bloodline, but by a bond deeper and truer than any arrangement crafted by human or wolf hands." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces alight with genuine interest and welcome, others carefully guarded in ways that told Alira the skepticism she had encountered in the council chamber had not been isolated to a single dissenting voice. "I know," Cale continued, his eyes sweeping across the assembled nobility with a firmness that dared any of them to challenge him openly, "that questions have been raised regarding her history, that some among you have called into question her worth, based on circumstances she did not choose and could not control. Let me be clear, to every pack represented in this hall today, Alira Hart is not diminished by what she lacks. She is defined by what she carries within her, a strength that answered my own wolf's call from 3 miles distant, a strength I witnessed with my own eyes, only days ago when she stood against an attack meant to end her life, before this very ceremony could take place." The murmur grew louder at this revelation, many in the crowd clearly hearing of the garden attack for the first time, and Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks at being made the center of such open discussion, though she forced herself to stand tall regardless. "Whoever sent that wolf believed her weak," Cale continued. "They were mistaken, and I suspect they now understand the depth of that mistake. Alira Hart will stand beside me, not as a token of tradition or convenience, but as my equal, my mate, and in time, your queen. Any who cannot accept this truth are welcome to voice their concerns to me directly, though I promise you, the outcome of such conversations will not favor continued objection." The threat beneath his words was unmistakable, and across the hall, Alira watched several faces pale slightly, particularly among those who had been most vocal in their skepticism during the earlier council session. Near the front of the crowd, Lyra Voss stood with an expression carefully schooled into polite interest, though Alira did not miss the tight set of her jaw, nor the brief, sharp glance exchanged between Lyra and a tall man standing near her, someone Alira did not recognize, but whose presence seemed to unsettle Lyra in ways her composed exterior could not entirely hide. Cale turned back to Alira then, and the formal cadence of his voice softened into something warmer, more personal, though it still carried clearly across the silent hall. "I know the years behind you have been marked by isolation and unkindness from those who should have protected you above all others. I cannot undo those years, but I can promise you every year that follows will be different. You will never again be hidden, never again be made to feel less than the remarkable person you are." He lifted her hand, pressing a formal kiss to her knuckles in a gesture that drew a collective murmur of approval from much of the gathered crowd, and Alira felt something inside her chest ease slightly at the sight of so many faces softening at the gesture, even if a stubborn few remained visibly unconvinced. The ceremony continued with formal introductions, pack by pack, each representative offering their acknowledgement of the newly declared bond, though the warmth of these greetings varied considerably depending on the speaker. Some offered genuine congratulations, their eyes carrying real curiosity rather than judgment. Others offered only the barest minimum of required courtesy, their true feelings on the matter carefully masked behind practiced neutrality. When the formal proceedings finally concluded and the hall shifted into a more relaxed celebration, Alira found herself pulled into conversation after conversation, names and faces blurring together, as she struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume of new acquaintances suddenly expected of her. Cale remained close throughout, though duty occasionally pulled him away to address matters requiring his direct attention, leaving her briefly alone amid the crowd. It was during one such moment that Lyra Voss approached her again, this time with a companion, the same tall man Alira had noticed exchanging glances with her earlier during Cale's speech. "Lady Alira," Lyra said smoothly, "allow me to introduce Silas Marrow, an old friend of my family." Silas offered a polite bow, though something in his expression, a coolness behind his eyes that did not quite match the courtesy of his gesture, left Alira instinctively wary. "A pleasure," he said, his voice smooth and unremarkable, the kind of voice that could slip through a crowd unnoticed. "The pleasure is mine," Alira replied carefully, though she found herself watching him more closely than the pleasantries of the moment strictly required. "Quite the ceremony," Silas remarked, his eyes flicking briefly toward the throne where Cale had returned to address a matter with several council members. "The king certainly does not shy from making his intentions known." "He speaks the truth," Alira said simply. "Of course," Silas agreed, though something in his tone carried an edge she could not quite name. Truth has a way of complicating things, does it not? Especially when it disrupts arrangements that many have spent years anticipating. The comment hung between them with obvious weight, and Alira glanced toward Lyra, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, her expression carefully neutral, despite the pointed nature of Silas's words. Whatever alliance existed between the two of them, Alira suspected it ran deeper than simple friendship, and the unease that had followed her since the garden attack settled more firmly into place. Before she could respond, Cale returned to her side, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic of the conversation, as both Silas and Lyra offered polite farewells and retreated back into the crowd. "What was that about?" Cale asked quietly, watching them go with narrowed eyes. "I am not entirely certain," Lyra admitted, "but I do not think it was simple courtesy." Cale's expression grew grave. "Silas Marrow," he said thoughtfully. "I do not know him well, though I recall he has spent considerable time in Lyra's company in recent months. I will have Edmund look into the connection more closely." As the celebration continued around them, music rising and laughter echoing through the great hall, Alira found herself watching the crowd with a new wariness, aware that somewhere within the glittering assembly of nobility, gathered to witness her declaration, at least some faces hid intentions far darker than the polite smiles they wore in public. The weeks following the announcement ceremony settled into a strange new rhythm, one Alira was still learning to navigate with each passing day. Mornings were spent in lessons with Edmund, who took it upon himself to educate her in the history and politics of the United Packs, filling gaps left by a childhood spent locked away from ordinary pack life. Afternoons often found her in the training yards, where Cale himself insisted on teaching her basic self-defense, unwilling to leave her vulnerable should another attack occur. "You may never shift," he told her during one such session, guiding her through a series of movements meant to help her use her human body more effectively. "But that does not mean you cannot learn to protect yourself. Whatever power rose in you during the garden attack, we do not yet understand it well enough to rely on it alone." Alira appreciated his patience, though the training left her exhausted most evenings, her muscles aching in ways they never had during her years of confinement. Still, there was something satisfying in the exhaustion, a tangible sign of progress, after so long spent simply enduring, rather than building toward anything. Edmund's investigation into Silas Marrow, meanwhile, had turned up little of substance in the weeks since the ceremony, though what he did uncover left Alira more unsettled rather than less. Silas came from a minor noble family with a history of shifting allegiances whenever advantageous, and his recent closeness with Lyra Voss appeared to have begun shortly after Cale's declaration of the bond, timing that struck both Edmund and Cale as suspicious even without concrete proof of wrongdoing. "Suspicion is not evidence," Cale said one evening, reviewing Edmund's latest report with a frustrated frown. "We cannot act against either of them without proof, and proof has proven frustratingly elusive." "Then we wait," Alira said, though the waiting had begun to wear on her nerves more than she cared to admit. The reprieve, such as it was, did not last long. Nearly a month after the announcement ceremony, word arrived that a delegation from a neighboring territory would be visiting the royal keep to discuss trade arrangements, a routine diplomatic matter that nonetheless required Cale's careful attention over several days of negotiation. Alira, still relatively new to court life, was expected to attend the formal dinners accompanying the visit, though the bulk of the actual negotiations fell to Cale and his council. It was during the second evening of the delegation's visit that the trouble began. Alira had excused herself early from the formal dinner, a headache building behind her eyes from the noise and crowded conversation of the hall, and made her way back toward her chambers accompanied only by a single guard, Callum, a steady and dependable young man who had been assigned to her personal protection since the garden incident. They had nearly reached her chambers when Callum suddenly stiffened, his hand moving instinctively toward the blade at his hip, eyes scanning the shadowed corridor ahead of them, with an alertness that immediately put Alira on edge. "What is it?" she whispered. "I am not certain," Callum murmured. "Something feels wrong." Before either of them could react further, the torches lining the corridor guttered and went out entirely, plunging the hallway into sudden darkness. Alira's heart leapt into her throat, old instincts from years of fear rising immediately to the surface. and she felt Callum move protectively in front of her, just as the sound of movement echoed from somewhere ahead in the blackness. "Stay behind me," Callum said, his voice tight with tension. The attack, when it came, was sudden and coordinated in a way that made clear it had been carefully planned. Two figures emerged from the darkness, moving with the speed and precision of trained fighters, rather than the desperate chaos of a random assault. Callum engaged the first immediately, steel ringing against steel in the darkness, while the second figure moved directly toward Alira, clearly intent on separating her from her protector. Fear surged through her, sharp and immediate, and with it came the same strange hum she had felt in the garden weeks before, rising rapidly toward something far more powerful. She backed against the corridor wall, her hands raised instinctively, and as the attacking figure closed the distance, the silver light burst from her chest once again, this time with far greater force than before. The attacker was thrown backward with enough power to crack against the stone wall of the corridor, crumpling to the ground in a heap. Alira stared at her own hands in stunned disbelief, the light still faintly glowing beneath her skin, before the sound of Callum's continued struggle pulled her attention back to the immediate danger. She moved without fully deciding to, some instinct overriding her usual caution, and pressed her glowing hand against the second attacker's shoulder, just as he raised his blade toward Callum's exposed back. The light surged again, throwing the man clear across the corridor, and buying Callum the moment he needed to regain the upper hand entirely. By the time the guard reinforcements arrived, alerted by the noise of the struggle, both attackers lay subdued on the corridor floor, and Alira stood trembling against the wall, adrenaline and lingering power still coursing through her veins. Cale arrived moments later, having been alerted the instant word reached the dining hall, his expression a mixture of fury and relief as he took in the scene before him. He crossed the corridor, in swift strides, pulling Alira into his arms, with a desperation that told her more clearly than words how frightened he had been. "I am unhurt," she said quickly, feeling his tension only ease slightly at the reassurance. "Callum protected me, and then something happened, the same thing as before, in the garden." Cale pulled back, just enough to look at her closely, his eyes searching her face with careful attention. "Your power is growing," he said quietly. "Or perhaps it is simply learning to answer you more readily." The subdued attackers were dragged before the king within the hour, and under Edmund's careful questioning, one of them, weakened and desperate to avoid further consequence, finally broke and revealed the name behind the attack. Silas Marrow had orchestrated both assaults, the garden attack and this latest attempt, acting on behalf of an alliance formed with Lyra Voss and several other disaffected council members who believed Alira's presence at court represented a dangerous instability that threatened their own long-held influence. "They believed you weak," Edmund said grimly, once the confession had been fully extracted. "They believed a girl with no wolf could be eliminated quietly, before the bond had time to fully settle, and before public opinion had time to shift firmly in your favor." Cale's expression had darkened considerably throughout the confession, a cold fury settling over his features that Alira had not seen from him before. "They will learn the cost of that assumption," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Both of them, and any who conspired alongside them." As guards were dispatched to locate and detain both Silas Marrow and Lyra Voss, Alira found herself standing in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, staring down at hands that had, twice now, saved her life, with a power she still did not fully understand. Whatever she carried within her, whatever her family and the court alike had once dismissed as absence and brokenness, it had proven itself again and again to be something far more formidable than any of them had ever imagined. The reckoning, she understood, was only just beginning. The guards sent to detain Silas Marrow returned empty-handed, reporting that his chambers stood abandoned, drawers emptied and windows left open to the night air, clear signs of a hurried escape made possible only by advance warning. Lyra Voss, when confronted directly by the king's guard within her own family's quarters, met the accusation with a composed denial that fooled no one present, though her carefully maintained innocence made immediate arrest a delicate matter, given her family's standing among the noble houses. "She will not simply confess," Edmund advised, standing before Cale and Alira in the king's private study, as they worked through the fallout of the failed attack. "Her family carries too much influence to be moved by accusation alone." We will need proof beyond the confession of a single conspirator desperate to save himself. Then we will find proof, Cale said, his patience clearly worn thin after the events of the evening. I will not allow her to remain within these walls, plotting further attempts against Alira's life, simply because her bloodline affords her the luxury of doubt. Alira listened to the exchange with a growing unease, aware that whatever action followed would carry consequences reaching far beyond the immediate danger she had faced. Lyra Voss represented one of the oldest and most respected families in the kingdom, and any misstep in handling the accusation risked fracturing the very alliances Cale had spent years carefully building among the United Pacts. There may be another way, she said quietly, drawing both men's attention. What do you propose? Cale asked. Alira considered her words carefully before continuing. If Silas has fled, he will need somewhere to go, resources to sustain himself, allies willing to shelter him. If Lyra truly conspired with him, some trace of that support will exist, communications, or funds, that even careful planning cannot entirely erase. Rather than confronting her directly again, perhaps we should watch, quietly, and let her own actions provide the proof her words refuse to give. Edmund's expression shifted with something like approval. A wise suggestion, he said. Patience over confrontation. It would not be the first time such an approach has succeeded where direct accusation failed. Cale studied Alira for a long moment, something warm and proud settling into his gaze despite the tension of the circumstances. You continue to surprise me, he said. Very well. We will proceed with caution, and let the truth reveal itself in its own time. The following days passed, under careful, quiet surveillance. Guards positioned discreetly to monitor Lyra's movements and communications, without alerting her to the scrutiny. Alira, meanwhile, found herself unable to fully relax despite the increased security surrounding her, the memory of the corridor attack, and the strange power that had answered her fear, still fresh and unsettling in her mind. It was Talia, unexpectedly, who provided the first real comfort during this tense period. A letter arrived from the Hart family estate, carried by a messenger who had traveled considerable distance to deliver it personally, and Alira opened it with cautious hope rather than the dread such correspondence might once have carried. Her sister's words filled the page in careful handwriting, describing the changes that had swept through the Hart household since Alira's departure, the whispers among the local pack that had shifted from shame to something closer to pride, as word spread of the royal declaration. Their parents, Talia wrote, had begun speaking of Alira differently in recent weeks, their fear giving way slowly to something that might, with enough time, grow into genuine regret for the years of hiding they had imposed upon her. I do not ask you to forgive them yet, Talia had written near the letter's close. I only wanted you to know that something has begun to shift here, and I believe, in time, it may shift further still. Whatever happens, know that I have always been proud to call you my sister, even when I lacked the courage to say so as often as I should have. Alira read the letter several times over, feeling old wounds ache with a mixture of lingering hurt and cautious hope. She was not ready, not yet, to fully reconcile with the parents who had kept her hidden for 19 years, but Talia's words offered a small comfort regardless, a reminder that not everything from her old life had been without warmth, even if that warmth had been buried beneath layers of fear and shame for far too long. Nearly a week after the corridor attack, the careful surveillance finally yielded results. A messenger intercepted near the eastern border of the royal territory carried correspondence between Lyra Voss and a location matching reports of Silas Marrow's likely hiding place, detailing not only continued support for his escape, but explicit reference to the failed attempts against Alira's life and plans for how future attempts might succeed where the first two had not. The evidence, once secured, left no room for further doubt. Cale called an emergency council session within hours of the discovery, and Alira stood beside him as the proof was presented before the full assembly, watching Lyra Voss's composed mask finally crack under the weight of undeniable truth. You conspired to murder my mate, Cale said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber with a coldness that left no doubt as to the gravity of the accusation. Twice, your allies attempted to end her life within these very walls. What say you in your defense? Lyra's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, years of quiet resentment spilling out in a torrent of justification that did little to soften the severity of her crimes. She spoke of years spent being groomed by her family for exactly the position Alira now held, of ambitions built and nurtured since childhood, suddenly stolen away by the arrival of a woman with no wolf and no standing, whose only claim to the throne rested on a bond Lyra insisted could not possibly be as absolute as Cale claimed. She is nothing, Lyra spat, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. A broken girl hidden away by her own family for shame. And you would choose her over generations of proper breeding, proper preparation, everything I have sacrificed to earn this place? The bond does not concern itself with breeding or sacrifice, Cale said, his voice hard as stone. It concerns itself with truth, and the truth, Lady Voss, is that Alira has proven herself more worthy of this throne through kindness and courage than you have proven through years of scheming and ambition. The council's judgment, when it came, was swift and severe. Lyra Voss was stripped of her noble standing and exiled from the royal territory. Her family's influence within the court diminished considerably as a consequence of her actions. Silas Marrow, once located through the very correspondence that had condemned Lyra, faced a similar fate. Banished from the United Pax entirely, his name struck from any future consideration of court favor. As the council session concluded and the chamber slowly emptied, Alira remained seated a while longer, processing the full weight of everything that had unfolded over the preceding weeks. The fear that had once defined so much of her life, first from her own family, then from the uncertain dangers of court politics, had finally begun to loosen its grip, replaced slowly by something she barely recognized after so many years of its absence. A quiet, steady confidence in exactly who she was and exactly where she belonged. Spring arrived at the royal territory, with a warmth that seemed to settle over the entire keep, and with it came the day Alira had once believed impossible for someone like her to ever experience. The coronation ceremony had been planned for months, following the resolution of the conspiracy that had once threatened her life, and as the day finally arrived, she found herself standing once again before a mirror, studying a reflection that had transformed so completely from the girl who once hid behind a curtain in a locked attic room. Nora fastened the final clasp of her gown, a deep silver that caught the morning light in a way that reminded Alira, not unpleasantly this time, of the power that had once surged through her in moments of danger. That power, she had come to understand over the months since the corridor attack, was not an absence at all, but something entirely unique to her. A rare gift, the healers, who examined her now believed connected to bloodlines, so old and so rare, that few records remained to fully explain it. Whatever the explanation, she had stopped needing others to validate its worth. She understood, finally and completely, that she had never been broken. A knock sounded at her chamber door, and Alira turned to find not a guard or attendant, but her sister Talia, dressed in fine traveling clothes, her face lit with an excitement that made her look younger than her 18 years. "You came," Alira said, crossing the room to embrace her sister properly, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily count. "Of course I came," Talia said, holding her tightly. "I would not miss this for anything in the world." Behind Talia, hesitant and uncertain in a way Alira had never before seen from either of them, stood her parents. Garrick and Renhart lingered near the doorway, clearly unsure of their welcome, and Alira felt old tension rise briefly in her chest at the sight of them, before something gentler settled in its place instead. "You are welcome here," she said quietly, and watched relief wash visibly over both their faces. "We do not deserve your kindness," Ren said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not after everything." "No," Alira agreed honestly. "But I have decided that carrying anger toward you forever would only continue the harm you began. I do not forget what happened. I may never fully understand why you chose fear over protecting me the way you should have, but I am willing to try, slowly, to build something different between us now." Garrick stepped forward, his composure cracking in a way she had rarely witnessed from him throughout her entire childhood. "We were wrong," he said simply. "Wrong to be ashamed of you, wrong to hide you away, wrong in nearly everything we believed about what made a person worthy of belonging. I am sorry, Alira. I do not expect that to undo the years we cost you, but I needed you to hear it, especially today of all days." The apology, imperfect and long overdue as it was, still settled something unsteady in Alira's chest, a small piece of healing she had not realized she still needed until it arrived. She embraced her father, then her mother, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel the presence of her family, without the weight of shame pressing down between them. The ceremony itself unfolded within the great hall, transformed once again for the occasion, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the uncertain tension that had marked the announcement months before. Representatives from every pack in the kingdom gathered to witness the formal crowning, and as Alira walked the long path toward the throne where Chaol waited, she felt no trace of the nervous fear that had once accompanied that same walk on the day of her declaration. Edmund stood near the throne, holding the ceremonial crown, his kind eyes crinkled with genuine warmth as she approached. Beside him, Chaol watched her cross the hall, with an expression that held nothing back, pride and love written plainly across his features, for the entire assembly to witness. "Alira Hart," Edmund said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "Chosen mate of the Alpha King, do you accept the responsibility and honor of standing as queen among the united packs, to protect and serve alongside your king in all matters that concern the well-being of our people?" "I do," Alira said, her voice steady and sure. The crown settled over her dark hair, light and elegant, and as the assembled crowd erupted into cheers and applause, Alira felt the last remnants of 19 years, spent hidden away finally, completely, fall away. Chaol took her hand, drawing her close as the celebration swelled around them, and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead that spoke more clearly than any formal declaration could, of everything that had grown between them since that first startling meeting in her attic room. "You once told me you did not know how to be anything other than hidden," he murmured, quiet enough that the words belonged only to the two of them, despite the noise surrounding them. "Look at you now." Alira smiled, and for the first time in her entire life, she felt the full weight of that word settle over her, without a trace of shame attached to it. Seen, known, chosen, not despite what others had once called broken, but because of the very thing that had made her different all along. Outside the great hall, beyond the celebration and the cheering crowd, the sun continued its steady climb across a clear spring sky, casting warm light over a kingdom that had, in its own slow and imperfect way, learned something valuable about the true meaning of strength. Not the kind measured by a wolf's shift or a bloodline's purity, but the kind that endured years of unkindness and emerged, against every expectation, whole. Alira Hart, once hidden away for being broken, now stood crowned and celebrated beside the king who had seen her worth from the very first moment their paths crossed, and as she looked out over the assembled crowd, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and permanent within her, that she had finally, truly, come home.